Just a civilian. The sniper instructor scoffed, unaware she held the range record. The morning smelled like gun oil and arrogance. Sergeant Dale Howick had been running the advanced marksmanship course at Fort Calloway for 6 years, and in that time, he had seen every type of shooter walk through those range gates. He had seen decorated veterans fumble their first long-range shot. He had seen cocky young recruits eat humble pie before lunch. He had sorted every kind of person into neat little boxes by the time they even touched a rifle. So when the small woman in civilian clothes stepped through the gate that Tuesday morning carrying a worn green range bag, his first instinct was to sigh. Her name was Maya Reyes, 31 years old, brown hair pulled back with no fuss. She wore a plain gray shirt, dusty boots, and no rank on her chest, no patches, no unit insignia, nothing that told you who she was or where she had been. She had filled out the visitor access form like everyone else, listed her occupation as contractor, and was directed to report to Sergeant Howick for range orientation. Howick looked her up and down the way only someone completely certain of their own judgment can. He saw the soft posture, the civilian shoes, the quiet way she stood back and let other people move around her. He made his call in under 4 seconds. Another observer type, maybe a journalist, maybe someone's wife doing a story on military training. He had seen plenty of those too. "You're with the civilian observer group?" he asked, not looking up from his clipboard. "No," Maya said, "I'm registered for the course." That got his eyes up. He scanned his list again. Reyes, M cleared for full participation. He looked at her again, slower this time, but his conclusion did not change. His expression shifted into something politely patient, the kind of face a man wears when he has already decided to be kind about correcting someone's mistake. "This is the advanced course," he said. 500 to 1,000 meters. We don't run a beginner track today." Maya nodded. "I know, that's why I signed up for this one." Howick smiled with his mouth but not his eyes. He was not going to argue with her in front of the others. He would just let the range do his talking for him. It always did. He had seen people walk onto his range with confidence bought from YouTube channels and weekend gun clubs, people who truly believed they knew what a 1,000-meter shot felt like until they actually tried to make one. The range was the most honest thing in the world. You either hit the target or you did not. There was no charm, no credential, no rank that could move a bullet 1 inch closer to center. He handed her a safety briefing card and pointed her toward the equipment table. What Sergeant Howick did not know, what he had no reason to look up and no instinct to question, was that Maya Reyes had spent the last 9 years doing work that very few people ever get cleared to know about. She had not come from a conventional military background. She had come from something quieter, something that left no patches on a shirt and no ribbons on a chest. She had learned to shoot not on a well-lit range with a coach standing behind her calling corrections, but in conditions that most shooters would call a nightmare. Heat shimmer off desert rock, wind that changed direction 3 times in a single breath, targets that did not stand still and wait. She had not learned marksmanship as a skill. She had learned it as a way to stay alive and to finish jobs that mattered. The difference between those two things is enormous, and it shows up in ways that are very hard to fake and very easy to see if you know what you are looking at. Howick did not know what he was looking at. He gathered the group at the shooting line. There were 7 participants total that day, 4 active-duty soldiers working on qualification scores, 1 federal law enforcement officer, 1 private contractor from a defense firm, and Maya. He gave his standard welcome speech. He talked about wind reading, about scope adjustment, about the patience required for long-distance work. He talked about breathing and trigger discipline, and the mental game of taking a shot you cannot fully control. He was good at this speech. He had given it hundreds of times. His voice carried authority because it had earned authority over years of genuine expertise. He just did not apply that expertise to reading the room. When he got to the part about equipment inspection, He walked the line slowly, checking each shooter's setup. He made small corrections here and there, adjusted a scope mount for the federal officer, pointed out a stock fit issue for one of the soldiers. When he reached Maya, he looked at her rifle with something between surprise and faint condescension. It was not a flashy gun. It was a bolt-action chambered in .308, with a quality but understated scope and a stock that had clearly seen years of real use. There were small marks on the form that looked like they had come from hard conditions, not a display case. It was clean, properly maintained, and completely unimpressive to someone who expected serious shooters to show up with serious-looking gear. "You qualified on this platform before?" Howick asked her. "Yes," she said. "At what distance?" She paused, not because she was uncertain, but because she was deciding how much of an answer to give. "Far enough," she said. Howick's mouth twitched. He moved on down the line. He did not know that the range record at Fort Calloway, the one posted on the wall in the range office, the one that had stood untouched for 3 years, had been set by a shooter whose name appeared in no official military directory. He did not know because no one had told him. The record had been logged during a joint evaluation that was not widely discussed, and the name beside it was listed simply as M. Ray's, contractor. The same name on his clipboard. The morning was just getting started. She lined up like she had done it 10,000 times because she had. The first drill of the morning was a group shooting exercise at 500 meters. Every shooter fired 5 rounds at their designated steel plate, and Sergeant Howick walked the line watching form, calling out adjustments. It was a warm-up, a baseline read. He used it every session to figure out who actually knew what they were doing before the real work began. The federal officer shot clean. 3 of the 4 soldiers grouped well. The defense contractor struggled a bit with wind but made reasonable corrections. Howick made his notes and moved along. When he stopped behind Maya, he was ready to be patient. She was already set. Prone position, body aligned naturally with the rifle, no tension in her shoulders, cheek pressed softly to the stock. Her breathing had slowed in a way that Howick, to his credit, noticed. He had seen enough shooters to know when someone was actually calm versus when someone was performing calm. She was not performing anything. She was simply still. She fired her 5 rounds. All 5 hit. Howick said nothing. 5 hits at 500 meters was not unusual among a group already screened for advanced participation. He scratched a small mark on his clipboard and moved on, but something sat uneasy in the back of his mind. It was not just the hits. It was the rhythm. Each shot had come with an unhurried steadiness, no adjustment between rounds, no pause to reconsider. She had not chased the target. She had simply expected to hit it, and she had. The second drill pushed the group out to 700 meters. This is where most shooters begin to feel the weight of distance. The target is still visible through a scope, but the margin for error shrinks fast. A small wind call mistake, a slight variation in trigger press, a breath held a half-second too long. Any of these can pull a shot far enough to miss clean. At 700 meters, confidence starts to separate from competence. 2 of the soldiers needed correction on their holds. The contractor missed his first 2 rounds and had to walk his shots in. The federal officer hit 4 of 5. Howick called encouragement down the line and worked through adjustments with each shooter. Maya fired 5 rounds, all 5 hit. This time Howick stopped walking. He stood behind her position a moment longer than necessary, watching. She broke the bolt back, cleared the case, and began loading again without looking at her hands. Her eyes stayed downrange. She was already reading the mirage off the ground between her and the target, watching the way the heat shimmer moved to judge wind at the midpoint. It was a technique that took years to learn to do instinctively. Most shooters read the flags at the firing line and the flags at the target. Reading the mirage at the middle distance was a layer above that, something coaches taught in theory, but only experience burned into habit. He told himself it could still be a lucky morning. Some days the wind sits down and everyone looks good. He moved the group to 850. At 850 meters, the steel target is a suggestion. You aim where you think the bullet needs to go, account for all the things trying to pull it away, and then you wait. The wait between trigger press and impact is long enough at that distance that a shooter has time to wonder if they called it right before they find out. It is humbling. It is supposed to be humbling. That is the point of long-distance training, to remind even the best shooters that the rifle is only part of the equation. The group spread out. Results varied. One soldier hit 3 of 5 and looked genuinely frustrated. The federal officer stepped back and asked Howick for a wind coaching session. The contractor missed all 5 and started checking his scope adjustments, blamming the glass. These were normal responses. Howick was not bothered by them. He expected struggle at this distance from this group. He watched Maya fire her first round. He was already writing a note on the clipboard when the steel rang. He looked up. She fired again. The steel rang again. Howick walked over and stood directly behind her. He watched her third shot. She exhaled slowly, the rifle barely moved, and then from 850 meters away came the delayed metallic sound of a bullet finding its mark. He watched the fourth. Same result. By the fifth, he had stopped writing anything. She rolled off the gun and sat up, brushing a bit of dust off her sleeve. She did not look at him. She looked downrange, calm as someone watching clouds. "You've done this before," he said. It came out flatter than he intended. "You asked me that this morning," she said. She was not rude about it. She said it simply, the way you say something that is just true. He wanted to ask her where she had trained. He wanted to ask who her instructor had been, what background she came from, what her official qualification records looked like. He wanted some box to put her in. But he had been on a range long enough to know that sometimes the answer to a question like that is not something a person will give you on a Tuesday morning in front of strangers. So he didn't ask. What he did was go back inside during the lunch break and pull up the range record board on the wall of his office. The top score, 1,000-meter cold bore shot, logged during a joint evaluation 32 months ago. Wind conditions that day had been rated difficult. The scorer's note said the shot was taken without a wind flag, using only mirage reading at the midpoint. Name: immerse contractor. He stood there for a long moment, reading it again as if the words might rearrange themselves. They didn't. He walked back to the range. The afternoon session was about to begin, and he had a decision to make about how he was going to handle the rest of the day. The woman who held his range record was waiting at the line. She was rechecking her wind data. She had not mentioned the record. She had not mentioned anything. She was just there to shoot. The afternoon session began with 1,000 meters, and Sergeant Howick said nothing about what he had found on the record board. He debated it during the walk back from his office. He could acknowledge it, make a thing of it, introduce her properly to the group. He could ask her about it directly, get her story, figure out who she really was. But something about the way she carried herself told him that she had not come here for recognition. She had come for the range time. Making a scene out of what he knew would have been more about his own discomfort than anything useful to her or the group, so he kept it quiet. He went back to being the instructor, and he resolved to watch more carefully than he had all morning. 1,000 meters is where long-range shooting stops being a skill and starts being a conversation between the shooter and everything in the world trying to stop the bullet. The Earth's rotation has a measurable effect at that distance. Temperature, humidity, the altitude of the range, the density of the air, all of it feeds into a firing solution that would look like a math problem to anyone not trained to read it as instinct. Most professional military snipers spend years building the internal calculator that makes those adjustments feel natural. Even then, they will tell you that 1,000-meter cold bore shot is never a sure thing. Howick set the group up and gave them time to build their data. He walked the line, asking each shooter what solution they were running, checking their logic, making small suggestions. It was the most important part of his instruction, not telling people where to aim, but teaching them how to think through the problem. When he reached Maya, she had already written her data in a small notebook. He glanced at it. The numbers were correct, not approximately correct, exactly correct, matching what his own ballistic calculator had generated for the conditions that afternoon. He had built that solution over 30 minutes of careful measurement. She had reached the same answer from reading the air. "You're not using a ballistic app," he said. "No," she said. "How are you getting your data?" She tapped the side of her head lightly with one finger. Then she went back to her notebook. He stood there a second too long, and she looked up at him with an expression that was patient but clear. She was not trying to be mysterious. She simply did not have a longer explanation to offer. The data was in her head because she had put it there over years of doing this for real, in places where there was no app, no range officer, and no second shot. The group fired their first rounds at 1,000 meters. It was messy, as Howick expected. One soldier hit on his third round after walking the shots in. The federal officer missed all 5 and asked to drop back to 850. The contractor hit once, called it luck with unusual honesty, and asked for coaching. 2 of the remaining soldiers were doing reasonable work with patient corrections from Howick. Maya was last on the line. She had waited, watching the others shoot. Howick noticed later that she had been studying the mirage, the way the heat moved at different points between the line and the target. She had been watching the grass at the 300-meter mark, where the ground dipped slightly and wind behaved differently than at the line. She had been collecting information the whole time the others were shooting. She settled into her position. Howick stood off to the side, not directly behind her this time, but angled enough to watch. She loaded a single round, just one. The range went quiet the way ranges do, when something is about to happen that everyone can feel. She fired. From 1,000 meters away, the steel rang with a sound like a hand slapping a table. Clean, first round, cold bore. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then one of the soldiers, a young staff sergeant named Britt, let out a slow breath that was almost a word. Howick looked at his data board. The wind had shifted 12 degrees in the last 20 minutes. She had accounted for that in her hold without being told. He had not told anyone about the shift because he was waiting to see who caught it. She had caught it. He walked over to her as she was clearing the rifle. "You want to tell me how long you've been doing this?" he asked. She thought about the question seriously. "Long enough that I don't think about it as doing anything," she said. "It's just how I see." He did not fully understand what she meant by that, but he filed it away. He had been teaching long enough to know that when a shooter says something like that, when the mechanics have dissolved completely into instinct, they are operating at a level that cannot be taught in a course. It can only be grown through years of high-stakes repetition. The kind of repetition that comes from needing to be right when being wrong has real consequences. Staff Sergeant Britt came up beside Howick after the session ended and looked at him with a question on his face that he didn't quite ask out loud. Howick answered it anyway. "She's not with any unit," he said quietly. "She's a contractor." Britt looked over at Maya, who was packing her bag with the same unhurried quiet she had arrived with. "What kind of contractor?" Britt asked. Howick picked up his clipboard. "The kind that doesn't tell you," he said. The wind picked up again across the range, carrying the smell of hot metal and dry earth. The targets downrange stood still. The day was not over yet, and neither was the lesson, though by now no one was quite sure who was teaching whom. By the final hour of the day, the group had stopped thinking of Maya as a curiosity. They had started watching her the way people watch someone they want to learn from. It happened gradually, the way most real shifts in perception happen. It was not one single shot or one single moment. It was the accumulation of a day's worth of evidence that could not be argued with, piled up quietly until even the most skeptical person in the group had no ground left to stand on. The range had done its talking, exactly as Howick had predicted it would that morning. He just had not expected it to talk about her the way it did. The final exercise of the day was a scenario drill. Howick explained it simply. Each shooter would engage 3 targets set at variable distances between 600 and 1,000 meters. The distances were not revealed in advance. Shooters would have to estimate range on their own using reticle subtension, then build a firing solution from scratch, then engage. They had 90 seconds per target. The goal was not just accuracy. It was the full process: seeing, thinking, solving, executing, done quickly and correctly under the pressure of a clock. This was the part of the course where Howick always found out the most about his shooters. Accuracy under no pressure was one thing. Accuracy while having to think fast and trust yourself was another thing entirely. He sent the group through one at a time. The soldiers did well. Military training had given them a structured process, and they followed it. 2 of them hit all 3 targets within the time limit. One missed his far target but made a respectable correction attempt. The federal officer hit 2 of 3. The contractor hit 1 clean and ran out of time on the second. These were fair results from a capable group. Then it was Maya's turn. She walked to the firing position without any visible change in manner. Howick started the clock. She got behind the rifle and glassed the first target, a small steel silhouette at what turned out to be 680 meters. She spent 4 seconds looking at it through the scope. Then she dialed, settled, and fired. Hit. Elapsed time, 11 seconds. She moved to the second target without being prompted. 790 meters. 6 seconds to read it, 2 seconds to adjust. She fired. Hit. Total elapsed time from first shot, 26 seconds. The third target was set at 940 meters, and the wind had shifted again. A live complication that Howick had arranged deliberately by asking his assistant to change the flag position on the far end while the other shooters were going. None of the previous shooters had noticed. Most of them had simply run the same solution they had been using all afternoon. Maya paused at the third target for 8 seconds. She was not stalling. She was reading. Howick could see her eyes move, one quick look at the mirage, a check of the near flag that she could see from her position, a small adjustment to her scope. Then she fired. Hit. Total time, 51 seconds. The group was quiet. Staff Sergeant Britt looked at his own score sheet, then at Howick, then downrange. The federal officer made a low sound that was not quite a word. The contractor just nodded slowly, the nod of someone acknowledging something they cannot explain away. Howick called the end of the exercise and gathered the group for the debrief. He ran through performance notes for each shooter, gave specific technical feedback, and made recommendations for what each person should focus on in their follow-up training. When he got to Maya, he paused for a beat. "Clean run," he said. "Best time of the day. Best total score of the day. The wind shift on the third target, you caught it when no one else did. How?" She looked at the ground for a moment, not out of shyness but out of genuine thought. She was trying to translate something automatic into words. The grass at the 300 mark was moving differently than it was moving at the 900 mark, she said. The far flag was wrong. It wasn't reading what was actually happening between the line and the target. I trusted what I saw in the middle more than I trusted the flag. Howick nodded. That was exactly the correct read. It was also the kind of read that took most shooters years to trust, because it required ignoring official instrumentation in favor of personal observation. The willingness to do that and to be right about it was not something a course produced. It came from somewhere else entirely. "Who trained you?" he asked again, quieter this time. She looked at him for a moment and then said, very simply, "Necessity." He accepted that. He had enough experience to know what it meant. The range was winding down. People were breaking down their gear, making notes, talking quietly among themselves. The day had the particular exhausted satisfaction that comes from hard work done well. Howick looked down the line at the target still standing in the distance, absorbing the last of the afternoon light. Behind him, He could hear Britt talking to Maya. The young sergeant was asking her something about wind reading technique, leaning in the way students lean when they are genuinely trying to absorb something. Maya was answering him carefully, in plain language, without making herself seem like anything other than someone trying to be helpful. She was not performing modesty. She was not performing anything. That, Howick realized, was the most impressive thing about her. The range cleared out slowly, the way it always does at the end of a long day. People lingered over their gear bags, checked their notes one more time, said their goodbyes with the easy familiarity that a shared hard day creates between strangers. The soldiers shook hands. The federal officer exchanged cards with the contractor. Britt thanked Maya twice, the second time more seriously than the first. She told him he had good instincts and just needed to trust them faster. He looked like he would be thinking about that for a while. Howick stayed behind after everyone else had walked to the parking area. He sat on the wooden bench at the back of the scoring station and wrote up his end-of-day report. Performance notes, range conditions, equipment issues. He did this after every session, while everything was still fresh. It was a discipline he had built years ago and never broken. When he got to the section for participant standouts, he sat with his pen hovering for a moment. He wrote Maya's name and her scores. He noted the wind correction on the third scenario target, the consistent first-round hits through the afternoon, the cold-bore 1,000-meter shot that had silenced the group in the way that only something genuinely impressive can silence a group of people who think they have seen everything. He wrote the numbers plainly and factually because that was what the report called for. Then he closed the notebook and sat back. He had spent the day being wrong about someone, and he knew it. Not just about her ability. Wrong at a deeper level, wrong to make a judgment at all before the range had a chance to speak. He was aware that this was not the first time he had done this, and the awareness sat uncomfortably, the way real self-honesty tends to sit. He had told himself for years that reading people quickly was a professional skill. He was not wrong about that. In certain contexts, fast judgment is a tool, but the tool had a limitation he had not fully accounted for, which was that fast judgment depends entirely on the cues available, and cues can be absent for reasons that have nothing to do with what they seem to suggest. Maya Reyes had arrived with no visible markers of expertise, because the work that built her expertise specifically required no markers. She had been shaped by a world where being unreadable was an asset, where carrying no signifiers of skill was, itself, a skill. His measure of her had been built from what she showed. What she showed was almost nothing. He had read the absence of signal as a signal of absence. He understood now why that was wrong. Maya was walking toward the exit gate when he caught up to her. She had her bag over one shoulder and was moving with the same quiet efficiency she had shown all day, like someone who is accustomed to leaving places without announcement. "Reyes," he said. She stopped and turned. He tried to find the right words for what he wanted to say, and then he decided that simple was better. "I looked at the record board at lunch," he said. "The 1,000-meter evaluation, 32 months ago." He paused. "I owe you an apology for this morning." She looked at him steadily. She did not tell him it was fine or wave it off or offer him the easy exit that people offer when they sense that someone is embarrassed. She let him say it, and she heard it, and she accepted it without performing forgiveness or making it bigger than it was. "You didn't know," she said. "Now you do." "Yeah," he said. "Now I do." She nodded once and turned to go. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She turned back. "The record board, 3 years it's been up there. You've never said anything about it to anyone here." She thought about this for a moment. "Records are just numbers," she said. "They don't tell you what you can do today. They just tell you what you could do that day." She shifted the bag on her shoulder. "I came here to see what I can do today." He nodded. She walked out through the gate and he watched her go. Back in the range office, the record board was still on the wall where it had always been. The top entry, the one that had stood for 32 months, still read what it had always read. M. Ray's contractor, wind conditions, difficult. Method, mirage at mid-distance, cold bore. Below it in the column for the next closest score were the names of decorated shooters, trained specialists, people who had come to this range with credentials and rank and the full weight of institutional training behind them. None of them had touched the top line. Tomorrow Howick would start a new day with a new group. He would do his walk, give his speech, inspect the gear, read the faces. He would still make fast assessments because that was part of doing his job well. But he would hold them a little more loosely now. He would remind himself that the range is the honest one, not him. That the steel downrange does not care what a person is wearing or where they came from or what box they seem to fit. The bullet either lands or it doesn't. The record either falls or it stands. It was still standing, and the woman who said it had walked away without a word, carrying everything she knew in a worn green bag and a quiet that said more about who she was than any patch, any rank, any title ever could. She had never needed anyone to know. She had only ever needed to be right.